Hello and welcome to UWO Now. I'm Wendell Ray. We're happy to have you join us for another conversation with a member of our UWO community. Traditionally, college campuses have been places where discussions of issues, some controversial, others not, but issues and even some protests occur regularly. A national survey conducted by the Freedom Forum found that Gen Z were least likely out of all their respondents to agree that free speech on college campuses, quote, fosters the free exchange of ideas, even if those ideas are hateful to some. Well, locally, in February of 2023, the University of Wisconsin system released a survey of students at its 13 campuses. The goal of this research was, quote, to explore and describe University of Wisconsin system students' knowledge of First Amendment rights connected to free speech, as well as their attitudes about viewpoint diversity and their experiences with free expression and self-censorship at UW universities. A mouthful. Well, we'll talk about that survey and its results with Dr. Tony Palmieri, a professor in the Communication Studies Department at UW Oshkosh. Thanks so much, Dr. Palmieri, for being with us here today on UWO.
Thank you, Wendell. Thank you for the invitation. It's really great to be here.
So the survey, you're aware of it, correct?
Yes.
What did you think about it when it came out?
Well, let's give a little bit of context to it. The original goal was to release it in the spring of 2022, but that was met with a lot of resistance, especially from faculty and instructional staff, along with the chancellors. In fact, the interim chancellor at UW Whitewater, his name was Jim Henderson, he literally resigned his position as chancellor because the system decided to go forward with this survey after originally saying they would not go forward with it because of the opposition from the chancellors. And Dr. Henderson was concerned that the system administration had given in to political pressure from the state legislature. Be that as it may, the system did decide to go forward. And as you said, in February, I believe, of 23, the survey, I believe 80,000 students were surveyed across the system. It was about 12%, probably about 10 to 12% students on the UW Oshkosh campus. I had a number of concerns. I was concerned about the politics of it. I thought that there were some members of the state legislature that already had a narrative in mind about what the UW is as regards free speech, how we're not tolerant of it. And I thought they wanted to use maybe a survey like this to reinforce their preconceived view, if you will.
So you think that was the impetus for the survey?
I've been on our campus for over 30 years now, and especially over the last 10 to 15 years, many members of the state legislature, mostly Republicans, have been highly critical of the university, especially on free speech grounds. I mean, one of the ironies, though, Wendell, is that while some of these politicians complain about the UW not supporting free speech, the fact is, in 2005, when I believe it was UW Whitewater tried to invite a guy named Ward Churchill. He was the guy, he was a professor at the University of Colorado. He was the one who compared the victims of 9/11 to World War II era Nazis.
Okay.
Right? And of course, he claimed he was misinterpreted and so on. I believe it was UW Whitewater tried to invite him to the campus. He did ultimately speak there. But our state legislature literally passed a resolution condemning the university for bringing him to the campus, and were threatening to cut funding if he came to speak. So that was a blatant act of intolerance, because the First Amendment, if it supports anything, it supports speech that we don't like. I mean, if the First Amendment only supports speech that we like, you really don't need a First Amendment.
Right.
So I was concerned about that. I was concerned about the hypocrisy. I was concerned about the politics, but also looking at the survey, Wendell. So many of the questions were so vague that you wondered, how could a student answer it other than it depends? I mean, here's just one example from a section on student attitudes about how to handle views felt to cause harm. Here's just one typical question.
Yeah.
If some students feel that certain views expressed on campus cause harm to certain groups of people, how much do you think that university administrators should ban the expression of those views? Well, I mean, it depends. Right. What views are we talking about? Mm-hmm. Who's being attacked? For what reason? What level of threat? So on so many of the questions on this survey, if I'm an 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old student looking at the survey, I'm thinking, I don't know, maybe not. There just wasn't, it seemed designed to gather certain results. And in fact, it did get those results. I mean, what the survey mostly found was that predominantly male students who identify as conservative, they were the ones that felt most oppressed as regards free speech.
Okay.
Right? And that students who identified primarily as female and liberal were most likely to support some kind of restraints on speech, even though those numbers were not as high as I think some of the politicians in Madison would have thought. Right? It turned out that UW students, for the most part, really want to see a thriving, lively environment for free speech. There's not much taste for banning speech in the system.
So do you think that the survey was worthy, was done well? Do you have questions about the survey? Do you believe the results? How do you feel once you read the questions and you talked about what you think the impetus was?
My view has always been that if we really want to find out the true state of free speech on a campus, we probably don't do it with surveys like this. It probably would be a good idea to do it with things like focus groups, where you get people in a room with trained social scientists who know how to do this kind of research, and we get students to actually talk about their experience. I think, for example, another troubling thing about this survey is, and I brought this with me because this was the most troubling part to me. They asked a question. Students were asked if they had ever engaged in various free speech behaviors on their campus, and students who engaged in the behavior were asked if they had received any negative institutional consequences, such as a warning, probation, suspension, or expulsion for expressing their views, or for any negative social consequences. Well, we had quite a number of students who reported that they had experienced institutional consequences. But here's the thing. Each UW system school would have that on record. And in fact, we do not have many records on file of institutional punishments for speech. And I think this survey invited people to say things like, I've received punishment for my speech, when in fact, if they had received that, you know how bureaucratic the UW system is, we would have a record of that. And the records of students being punished for free speech activities is very, very lean. The students are not often punished for free speech activities. So I was bothered by that. What I found most valuable about the survey was something that we already know, which is that not enough students know enough about the First Amendment. Did we really need to have a survey to find that out? I think only 30% of the students surveyed said that the First Amendment had ever come up in their classes. Now, I happen to teach a class called the First Amendment and Freedom of Speech.
Okay.
But it's an elective that's offered once every 2 years, and I get 25 to 30 students in it. right? Out of a campus of, I believe, over 8,000. So not everyone takes a class in the First Amendment. And of course, for good reasons, it doesn't come up in most classes. I mean,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah, that was one of the questions I had. Well, let me go back and talk about a couple of things. You mentioned maybe political ideology earlier, and what this survey may have been proved or not proven, or did not prove. Of those surveyed, students who did identify a political affiliation, 33.6% identified as a Democrat, 23.4% as a Republican, 25.7% as an independent or unaffiliated, 13% other, 4% no response. And then also to your question, or the question about classroom environment.
Yeah.
Students' perceptions of the classroom environment for students with unpopular views. How often, the question is, do you feel your instructors create a classroom environment in which students with unpopular views, one, would feel comfortable expressing them? 24% said never or rarely do an instructor create that classroom environment. 67% said sometimes or often their instructors create a classroom environment in which students with unpopular views can express them, would feel comfortable expressing them. Did that surprise you?
No, it does not surprise me. But the idea that a student comes out of high school and already has a firm set of beliefs and values, and what are we supposed to do in the classroom? Are we supposed to stand there and say, "Oh, I'm glad you believe that. Thanks for contributing"? Our whole educational system is rooted in what's called the Socratic tradition, where we are supposed to question people. And I think what has happened in our modern day culture is many people confuse being questioned with being forced or intimidated. So, I mean, I think I'm typical of most professors. If I'm in a room and a student, whether they consider themselves liberal, moderate, conservative, radical, if they say something in my classroom that sounds very, very uninformed, I think it's my job, and I think your listeners will agree with me, it's my job to challenge them on that. Why do you feel that way? Right?
Yeah.
Why? And this idea that we already know what are popular or unpopular views are, I think it's a reasonable question in the classroom. What is a popular view? I mean, think about what was unpopular 100 years ago and is now considered to be a very popular view. I bring this up in my classes a lot. 100 years ago, saying that women should vote would have been an unpopular view. I don't think it's unpopular anymore.
Right.
We had to question so many things in our society that used to be unpopular are now popular, and vice versa.
So one of the questions I think that you alluded to is the percentage of students choosing, why students chose not to, or let me just ask the question. For students who reported expressing their views on a controversial topic in class, the reasons for expressing those views were overwhelmingly that they were in a class that encouraged that discussion. 91% said that. 91% also said they really cared about the topic, and 92% said that they felt they knew enough about the topic to talk about it. For those who decided not to express their views on a controversial topic in class, the reasons they cited for not expressing those views, 58% said they worried other students would dismiss their views as offensive. 60% says they felt they did not know enough about the topic, or 61% said they worried other students would disagree with them. So if they did have a feeling about not expressing, it seems that it was more about their peers than it was about the institution or about their individual professor having a certain feeling about them.
Yeah, I agree, and it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? If we think about the traditional college age students, the 18 to 22-year-olds, they are extremely concerned about what their peers think. We call that peer pressure. So it makes complete sense that their hesitation would be about what are others going to think. I do think that some of the politicians thought that the answer to that question would be, no, it's the woke professors that are the reason why I'm not speaking out. Mm-hmm. And in fact, throughout the entire system, the survey did not show that.
You're listening to UWO Now. I'm your host, Wendell Ray, and we're talking about a survey of UW students on free speech and First Amendment rights. Communication Studies Professor Dr. Tony Palmieri is our guest. One of the goals of the UW survey of students was to explore and describe students' knowledge of First Amendment rights connected to free speech. I'll recite the percent of students who answered 3 specific First Amendment questions correctly, followed by the students' average score. As it relates to free speech, question: yes, it is protected to someone. Their views are not welcome. It is okay to tell someone their views are not welcome. 34.7% said yes to that, and were correct. Yes, it is protected to say on social media that persons of their race or ethnicity are not welcome. 15.1% got that correct. No, their university cannot ban hate speech. 26.4% got that correct. The average number of correct answers of the 13 questions in this area that were asked, the average number of correct responses was 7.41, or about 57%. So to your point, what is startling, I guess, is what people really know or don't know about the First Amendment and their rights and what's protected or not protected.
Yeah, and really, it shouldn't wait until the university. I think we would all agree that there should be some instruction, not just in the First Amendment, but the entire Bill of Rights from really grade school. The First Amendment, I think, obviously, because we need people to participate in a democracy for it to be worthwhile and functioning, and that's why.
And to understand how it works.
Yeah, to understand how it works.
What your rights are, yeah.
Right. But I know when I teach the First Amendment and free speech, I always, on the first day or two of class, I ask students what they know about free speech, and most of them don't know that much about it. The good news is they want to learn.
Yeah.
And that's what I think we're not doing, not just in Wisconsin, but nationally. There is this great desire to learn about these things, but we really are not teaching it for a variety of different reasons. But having said that, though, the First Amendment is not black and white. I mean, there are many, many different interpretations. In fact, probably the biggest misconception of the First Amendment is that it protects all speech. And really, from the time it was written, the so-called founders adopted the meaning of free speech that came out of 18th century England, which was that they were guided by a judge named Blackstone, who wrote this famous volume of works called Blackstone's Commentaries. And Blackstone said, free speech means that you can't prevent someone from speaking, but once they speak, all hell can break loose. Right?
Okay.
So there's this misunderstanding that free speech means, you can say whatever you want whenever you want. That's never been what free speech means. Free speech in American jurisprudence, free speech has always meant no prior restraint of speech. Right? We can't stop you from talking, but once you talk, any number of things can happen.
Yeah.
And that's why we have laws against defamation. Because if we had absolute free speech, that means you and I would be able to defame each other without any potential consequence for it. And the courts over the years have identified numerous ways in which speech can be constrained. And again, that's why I'm so frustrated by these politicians who make it sound like, in America, we've never we've never constrained speech. Yes, we've constrained speech a lot.
You're listening to UWO Now. I'm Wendell Ray. We're talking today about free speech on UWO campuses with UWO Communication Studies professor, Dr. Tony Palmieri. Why don't you tell us, Dr. Palmieri, what your path to UWO has been, how you got here and your background and what you teach?
I think so much of my early life almost seemed designed to set me up for talking about free speech. I was born in Brooklyn, New York. In the early 1960s, as a kid, I was in the turmoil of the 60s, watching so much of it in New York City where I was growing up, developed this real interest in how people persuade each other and the kind of language that they use and persuasive tactics to use. Make a long story short, I went for a doctorate degree in Detroit, Michigan at Wayne State University, and Detroit is also a highly urban, contentious type of place. And there I learned so much about our society and the need to have a thriving democracy. And I got to UW Oshkosh in 1989. And really in all that time, I've actually seen myself as kind of a free speech practitioner. Back in the 90s, I used to do a television show for Titan TV.
Okay.
It was called Commentary, and it was designed to interview local politicians and leaders in the community. And then I did a radio part of that, too. We called it Radio Commentary. And I always had students doing all the producing and hosting, co-hosting, and so on. That was fun. And for the last 20 years, I've been writing a blog called Tony Palmieri's Media Rants. I write a lot about free speech types of issues. And I'm also doing a podcast myself called Running on MT with one of my former students, a guy named Matt King. He was a student back in the early 90s. We stayed in touch, and we put it on YouTube. It's fun, but we get into a variety of issues. So I've always really loved Oshkosh because it's largely the children of working class people, and I'm from a heavily working class background. My dad was a shoemaker in Brooklyn. My mom raised my two brothers and I. Then she worked for McDonald's for 30 years.
Okay.
And when I came to Oshkosh, I saw myself in the students. So many of our students are first-generation college students, which is what I was, right? Mm-hmm. The kind of people who need a thriving First Amendment so that their needs can be advocated for. And I've always felt kind of at home for that reason. I don't think it's a coincidence that, I don't know how much you know about the history of Oshkosh, but the south side of Oshkosh used to be called Brooklyn, and the north side of Oshkosh used to be called Athens.
No.
Yeah, I learned that when I got here. I thought,
and why is that?
I thought from Brooklyn. Well, because Brooklyn, New York City, heavily working class. South side of Oshkosh, heavily working class, right? And Athens, the home of, Socrates, Plato. Athens, north side, were the university, right?
Okay, all right.
So the Brooklyn and Athens made a lot of sense. And when I learned that in my first year in Oshkosh, I thought, oh, yeah, I think I belong here.
So what do you think has been, since you've been here so long, about what have you noticed, or have you noticed, students' understanding of the First Amendment? Better, worse, about the same throughout the years? What have you noticed?
I think that the Zoomer generation, the current generation, gets unfairly stereotyped as wanting to ban speech or not wanting to discuss. I haven't seen great variety across generations. What I've noticed over the years is that most students are hesitant to state their views,
and that's always been the case.
It's always been the case, but I think that has a lot less to do with political pressure and a lot more to do with people being from smaller communities where, I'm from a large city of 8 million people. Many students come to our campus, and Oshkosh is a large city.
Yeah, well, you're right.
Right?
Yeah.
So unless they're from Milwaukee or the Milwaukee suburbs or Chicago, Oshkosh is pretty large. So they get into a classroom And they're trying to learn. I mean, what I have noticed over the years, and this makes sense, as people get to their junior and senior year, they are much, much more likely to be outspoken about whatever they're interested in. Mm-hmm. We are lucky in my department, Comm Studies, and in your area, Radio, TV, Film, where thankfully all of our professors, our faculty, instructional staff, everyone encourages dialogue and communication. I mean, there's not one exception to that. I sound like I'm bragging about our departments, but I think there's a lot worth bragging about.
I do.
Because we actively encourage people to speak. Do people's feelings get hurt? Yeah. But that's going to happen in an academic environment where you're testing people's values and attitudes. So I don't think they're that much different now than they were, 20, 30 years ago. What has changed now is, and this is so cliche now, the social media environment is so brutal. Mm-hmm. And so today, many of our students get their introduction to issues on social media where it's heavily polarized and bitter. And I think that has made them maybe a little bit more reticent. I remember 30 years ago when I started teaching, I might bring up an issue in the classroom and it might be the first time students have ever heard that issue. But now I think thanks to social media, it's rare that you bring up an issue and people haven't heard something about it. And, the big challenge now for me is to tell students, to educate students to realize that when they're on the internet, they're mostly communicating with an algorithm. So, right? So that if they start engaging right-wing stuff exclusively, they're going to get all right-wing stuff. If they're engaging left-wing stuff exclusively, they're going to get all that. So I try to actively teach students ways of engaging with sources from across the entire spectrum in a way to kind of outwit the algorithm. Because I think one of the worst things in life is to be so tunnel visioned that you can't see outside your small little bubble that you've built around yourself.
And what's been the response to that suggestion that they try and sample other viewpoints?
Mostly positive. I mean, I think so many students and so many Americans in general are not aware of how much material is out there. And, right? These algorithms are set up. I mean, even cable TV works this way, correct? The Fox viewers are never supposed to turn the channel to MSNBC, and the MSNBC viewers, right? The idea is to try to engage a wide variety of viewpoints. I mean, I always like to test my own ideas because how am I going to know if what I'm believing is accurate or worthy of believing unless I get it challenged?
So to a communications professional, expert, what do you think is the state of American communication, dialogue?
Not very good. I think for a number of reasons. Again, it's become cliche to blame social media, but I think it's much, much deeper than that. Not only do we not teach civics well enough in our, say, K through 12 and even universities, but a big part of it also is interpersonal communication. I mean, so many of us just don't know how to get along with other people, regardless of what we're talking about, whether it's politics or whatnot. So, I mean, think about it. If someone is in a home life where there's stress and tension and inability to communicate needs, wants, and so on, why then would we expect that that person is going to get into the public arena and be ready to engage serious issues? So we need a lot of education in civics, but also interpersonal communication, workplace communication, right? So we're not doing well right now.
So let me kind of wrap up the first part of the discussion we had before we go into what people actually know about the First Amendment. Do you think on college campuses from your experiences, and even maybe from what can be gleaned from this survey, that there's a need to protect free speech on college campuses, or to ensure that it is indeed occurring?
I do think that there is a need to protect free speech. I don't think that the opposition to free speech is as great as some of our politicians think. I'm old enough to remember a time when universities were thought to be places where you would bring in the most controversial speaker, because the idea was that the university is a place to test that, right? Mm-hmm. And I still think a university should be that. The problem we have now is speakers, especially at large universities, the UC Berkeley's and the Madisons and places like that, often groups will bring in controversial speakers for the purpose of trolling other people, right? And see, that to me, that's not what it should be. It should be about someone's got a controversial thought. Let's bring them into the university in an intellectual environment, right? But instead, for example, Madison wanted to bring in this conservative provocateur, I'll call him, Matt Walsh.
Okay.
And I mean, on his social media profile, he labels himself, this is his words, he calls himself a theocratic fascist. So now, when you're trying to bring to campus someone who is labeling himself a theocratic fascist and has been very open about his opposition to transgender, so on, why would we think there wouldn't be an attempt to say to the administration, maybe we shouldn't bring that guy on? In other words, I don't think when there are too many groups in our country right now that if they're going to bring a speaker, it's not to have a dialogue. It's to be provocative. And I think we need to get to a point where we can say, let's try to bring in controversial ideas, but let's not do it in a way that is designed to provoke and agitate people because of who they are, if that makes sense.
Sure. I understand what you're saying. You're listening to UWO Now. I'm Wendell Ray, and we're talking about free speech on UW campuses with UW Communications Studies Professor, Dr. Tony Palmieri. Before I ask the question, do you or can you name the 5 freedoms protected by the First Amendment? Do you know what they are? Most people say the First Amendment, that means freedom of speech.
Yeah.
Maybe freedom of religion will get in there. But there's also the freedom of the press, freedom to assemble peaceably, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Did you get all those?
Yeah.
Well, if you don't, you may want to, as Dr. Palmieri says, maybe bone up on your civics lessons. Does that surprise you, though, that most Americans don't know all of the First Amendment, and why should they?
Right. I mean, if it was talked about more, they would know it, correct? It just doesn't come up enough in schools or at home or in other contexts. I actually think the part of the First Amendment that is probably the most important, we often say freedom of the press, and obviously that is vital, but the petition to the government for a redress of grievances, so many of our fellow citizens feel so powerless navigating our society. And I always try and get my students, I teach a class called Introduction to Rhetoric and Public Advocacy.
Okay.
The goal of that course is to make students realize that they have agency, they can do things. And part of that is petitioning the government for a redress of grievances. So, for example, so many students on our campus are upset about things like, people don't shovel ice on the sidewalks. The city doesn't clean up garbage in student areas. And I always say to them, you realize you can do something about that, right?
Yeah, right.
You can petition the government for a redress of those grievances, because politicians respond to one thing: pressure, right? That's the petitioning for the redress of grievances. So I think that part of it is so important. Like the freedom of assembly. Often students will get a little nervous when they see people marching for a cause. That's peaceful assembly.
Yeah.
You can do that. And I think the so-called founders realized that if you don't have enough citizens doing that kind of thing, you will fall into autocracy. And, at a big picture level, Wendell, that's my big fear right now as an American citizen, that I think we've taken our democratic rights and values for granted for so many decades now. And I don't know about you, I just feel them slowly but surely slipping away.
And why do you feel that way?
I can't locate it at any one particular historical moment, but I think especially since September 11th, 2001, we have allowed so many attacks on freedom in the name of security. We're still in the so-called war on terror era, and I think that has wreaked havoc on our Bill of Rights. And I think we've become a much more paranoid society. And not to pick on former President Donald Trump, but I think that someone like that emerges in an environment where we start to think, you know what? Maybe we need strong men to fix things for us.
Okay.
Right? Donald Trump has always marketed himself, right, as the strong man who will fix problems. And I think what happens in societies is that when we start tolerating attacks on our freedoms, when we start losing the idea that it is all of our responsibilities to run our society, that's when the strong man becomes attractive. And I find that very scary personally.
And as we talked about, people maybe not having a good enough grasp on their rights as guaranteed by the Constitution, do you get the sense that they're just people who have more, as they might say, more important things to think about than what the Constitution says, or they just don't pay enough attention to those laws and rights?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, life is hard. I mean, families are struggling to get by. We know that a huge percentage of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. We know that millions of Americans do not have any emergency fund to get them through even a minimal crisis. So in that environment, can we really say to those people, you need to be thinking about the First Amendment? Right? Or ironically, the First Amendment is really the answer for those folks. Because I know, for example, I've always considered myself a kind of First Amendment activist, and part of that was getting elected to the Oshkosh City Council, which I served on for 4 years. And one thing that frustrated me so greatly when I was on the Oshkosh City Council, and I should have known this going in, I went in thinking that the people I really want to help are the lower income, struggling people, right? Kind of people that I grew up with, right? And what I learned, and I should have known this already from talking to my buddies in the political science department, the people, when you're in government at any level, the people that you mostly hear from are the people with means, the people that are doing well. They have the system figured out. They know what their interests are. Right? The people that are not getting treated well by the system, they're often taught to be quiet, you can't fight City Hall, and so on.
And they're intimidated by this.
They're intimidated by it. I spent so many years on that council trying to get the average, everyday people to come out and speak, because every day I was hearing from the well-to-do who know exactly what they want. And I think we need to kind of not reverse that, because the well-to-do have every right to be outspoken and pursue their agenda. But I want to see it more balanced out so that our First Amendment is being used by everyone, especially the people who really need to be advocated for and to advocate for themselves more forcefully.
And what are your thoughts about the freedom of the press, with so many people now being able to express themselves online, setting up accounts and becoming their own types of journalists. They have
Well, I'm one of those
freedom to
people.
do that.
I'm one of those people who, in the mid '90s, thought that the internet was going to be this great small d democratic dream, that it would finally be the way that we would get this universal marketplace of ideas where everyone would be heard. And it hasn't really worked out that way, has it?
It's been different.
I think freedom of the press is, I think the establishment media have never really figured out how to use the internet. So many of the traditional print media have set up paywalls, which discourages people from engaging them. And then, of course, as you know from what you teach, the amount of companies now that own the media is so tiny.
Yeah.
So
And they own so many.
yeah, and I'm always so shocked that these politicians who talk about viewpoint diversity, they seem not to be bothered by this huge concentration of media ownership. Because when the Gannett Corporation owns literally every major newspaper in the state of Wisconsin, that cannot be good for viewpoint diversity.
No.
Right?
Local ownership has
Right.
really dwindled in all
Right.
all forms of
I'm old enough
communication.
to remember a time when even cities the size of Oshkosh had two newspapers
competing.
and
yeah.
competing. That's gone. We've had a podcasting boom, and I think podcasting is great. Unfortunately, too many people are in their own little bubbles with podcasts. They only listen to a certain small number of them. So what's so frustrating is, because of our technology and our technological advancements, the potential for a media that serves a small d democratic republic, the potential for that is so great. But for so many different reasons, it's not there yet. I just think that those of us who believe in those things, you remember that lead singer of, what was it, the Dead Kennedys, Jello Biafra, from the 90s, independent punk rocker.
Oh, tell me about it.
Yeah, he had this famous quote. It was something like, don't be angry at the media, be the media, right? To me, that's the answer. Every one of us have to find a way to be the media. What I always tell people is, if you find an independent source that is, say, a Substack column or a podcast that's being run by someone that you perceive to have integrity, that's trying to make a positive contribution, make a donation. Help those people make it. And, I try to do that. But for me, it's got to be someone that I think is operating with integrity and is an independent mind. I love independent media. The establishment media has not gotten it done for us. And unfortunately, the independents don't always reach the largest audience, but I think that's because not enough of us are doing enough to help them promote themselves.
All right. We're going to have to stop it right there. Thanks so much, Dr. Palmieri, for coming by and talking to us today. It's been a good discussion.
Yeah, it's been a great one. Let's do it again at some point.
Thanks, everyone, for listening to UWO Now. Remember to catch the latest episode of UWO Now. You got to go to our website, wrst.org, or you can watch us on the UWO YouTube page. UWO Now is also available, as you know, on platforms like Spotify, Apple, Amazon, and Google. I'm Wendell Ray. Thanks so much for listening.